The English Channel, June 6, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. The sun will not rise for another 28 minutes. A wooden boat is moving through darkness that is not quite darkness anymore. She is 83 feet long, built of oak and mahogany by a yard in Brooklyn that had spent the 1930s making pleasure cruisers for men with money. She carries 2 gasoline engines, 600 horsepower each, and a fuel load that would turn her into a torch if a single incendiary round found her tanks. Her crew have been awake for more than a day. Her name, on the paperwork, is a number. Her nickname, among the men who sail her, is the sort of joke that men make when they have been told what they are about to do. They call her a matchbox. She is not there to fight. She carries 1 small gun forward and almost nothing else. She is there because the water she is floating in is 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Understand what that number means in a human body. In water at 52 degrees, a man wearing a wool uniform, a helmet, a rifle, ammunition, and a pack that can weigh 60 pounds or more does not swim. He sinks. And if he does not sink, if he somehow stays on the surface, the cold begins its work immediately. Within 10 or 15 minutes, his fingers no longer close on command. He cannot grip a rope, he cannot grip a rail. He cannot take hold of the very thing that has been thrown to him to save his life. He can see it. He simply cannot hold it. And in the next several hours, along a 50-mile stretch of the Norman coast, several thousand men are going to end up in that water. At 5:30 in the morning, before the sun is up, before the first landing craft has touched Norman sand, before the first American soldier has fired a rifle at a German position, this boat begins pulling men out of the sea. By 9:30 that morning, she will have taken 90 men aboard. By nightfall, 126. Here is the part that should stop you. Nobody had ever done this before. Not at Sicily, not at Salerno, not at Anzio, not at Tarawa, not at any of the great amphibious assaults the Allies had already fought, in which men also went into the water, and also drowned, and also died of cold. In every previous landing of the war, the men who went into the sea were rescued by whoever happened to be nearby and happened to have the time. And on a beach under fire, at the exact moment of an assault, nobody has the time. That is the entire point of an assault. It is a schedule. It is the most rigid schedule human beings have ever attempted to keep under fire, and every craft in it has a place to be and a minute to be there. So for 4 years of amphibious war, the men in the water were, in the coldest possible institutional sense, not anybody's job. On June 6, 1944, for the first time they were. 60 wooden boats had been assembled, crewed, shipped across the Atlantic, and stationed off 5 beaches for the sole and specific purpose of picking up human beings out of the sea. They had no other mission. They were not there to shoot anything. They were not there to land anything. They existed for one reason. Somebody, somewhere in the enormous machinery of the greatest invasion in history, had finally asked a question that 4 years of amphibious warfare had never put on paper. What happens to the ones who fall in? By the end of that day, those 60 boats had pulled more than 400 men out of the English Channel. By the time the unit was stood down in December, the number was 1,438. 1,438 men who, in any previous operation of the war, would simply have been left. This is not the story you have been told about D-Day, and the reason it is not is more interesting than the story itself. If this kind of history is what you are here for, the parts that get left out of the standard account, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this sort of thing reach the people who want it. To understand why nobody had done this before, you have to be honest about what an amphibious assault actually is. It is a scheduling problem wrapped around a killing zone. The Allied plan for the Normandy beaches was among the most complex pieces of choreography ever attempted. Landing craft were to touch down in waves separated by minutes. Demolition teams were to arrive behind the 1st Infantry with roughly half an hour to clear beach obstacles before the tide covered them. Tanks were to arrive with the infantry, not after. Engineers, artillery, headquarters units, medical detachments, all of it stacked in a sequence rehearsed for months. The transports that carried the men lay 11 miles offshore. 11 miles, in a small boat, in a swell, is a very long way. The men in those boats had been aboard them for hours before they ever reached the beach, soaked, cold, and in many cases so violently seasick that they arrived at the shoreline already exhausted. Everything about this plan assumed forward motion. If a landing craft carrying 30 men stopped to pull 4 men from the water, it arrived late, and the wave behind it arrived late, and a wave that arrives late arrives on a beach where the enemy has had extra minutes to recover. Now, you will sometimes hear that there was a standing order at Normandy that ships would not stop for survivors, that the Allied command coldly instructed its crews to sail past drowning men. I have looked for that order. It does not appear to exist. There is no documented instruction at Normandy telling vessels to ignore men in the water, and there are documented cases of captains stopping anyway, on their own authority. A British destroyer off the eastern beaches pulled roughly 100 men from the sea after a Norwegian ship was torpedoed, and her captain did it by setting aside what he had been told. So the truth is harder to look at than the myth. There was no cruel order. There was something worse. There was a plan so tight, so intricate, so dependent on every part moving at its appointed minute, that stopping was not forbidden. It was simply not accounted for. The men in the water were not condemned by anybody's decision. They fell into a gap in the design, and a gap in the design is how most people actually die in a modern war. Now, I want to demonstrate that gap rather than simply assert it, because this is the load-bearing claim of the entire story, and it deserves evidence. Go to Tarawa, in the Central Pacific, in November 1943, 7 months before Normandy. The American plan required Marines to cross a coral reef to reach the beach. The tracked amphibious vehicles that could climb that reef were in short supply. Colonel David Shoup, who would command the assault ashore and would win the Medal of Honor for it, asked Admiral Raymond Spruance for shallow draft boats that could get his men across. The answer, recorded in the official Marine Corps history of the battle, was 2 words: not available. Expect only the usual wooden landing craft, the Admiral told him. What happened at Tarawa is what happens when landing craft meet a reef they cannot cross. The boats grounded hundreds of yards out. The Marines went over the side and waded, and the ones who stepped into a hole in the coral went under with 60 pounds of equipment on their backs, and some of them drowned within sight of the beach while under machine gun fire. 90 of the amphibious tractors were destroyed, with the loss of more than 300 men. There was no rescue force. Rescue at Tarawa was improvised by whoever saw it happening. The naval history records one landing craft coxswain, unnamed, who took his boat in and pulled 13 wounded men out on his own initiative. 1 man, 1 boat, because he decided to. Now go to Anzio, January 1944, 5 months before Normandy. Landing ship 422, carrying American troops, drifted into a minefield about 12 miles offshore at 5:20 in the morning. A mine detonated her cargo. 454 Americans died, and 29 British sailors with them. 53 men survived. And who pulled those 53 out of the water? Minesweepers. Ships whose job that morning was to clear mines, who stopped clearing mines because there were men drowning in front of them and no one else was coming. Between that ship and one other, the minesweepers recovered about 150 men. That is not a rescue service. That is a rescue service's absence, being filled by whoever happened to be nearest, at the cost of the job they were actually sent to do. Salerno, the same. Sicily, the same. In every case, men in the water were pulled out by ships that had been sent to do something else, if they were pulled out at all. This is what makes what happened off Normandy genuinely without precedent. It is not that the Allies suddenly cared about drowning men. Men had always cared. The coxswain at Tarawa cared. The minesweeper crews at Anzio cared. It is that for the first time, caring was assigned to somebody. It was given boats and men and a place in the operational plan. And that had never happened before in the history of naval warfare. Now, there is a moment in the spring of 1944 that almost everyone who tells this story reaches for at this point, and I am going to tell it to you, and then I am going to tell you why it does not mean what it is usually made to mean. On the night of April 27th and into the early hours of April 28, 1944, in Lyme Bay off the south coast of England, a convoy of American landing ships was carrying out a full-dress rehearsal for the Utah Beach landings. The exercise was code-named Tiger. The men aboard were the men who would go in at Utah. German fast attack boats found them in the dark. What followed was not a battle. Landing ships were torpedoed. Men went over the side into a sea that was, in late April, colder than it would be in June. And then a detail emerged from the aftermath that ought to be taught in every military school in the world. The men had been issued inflatable life belts, worn around the body, and a great many of them had worn the belt around the waist, which is where a belt goes, which is where any reasonable person would put it. But a soldier in full kit does not float like a swimmer. His weight is high and back, in the pack. A life belt buckled at his waist provides its buoyancy at the wrong point on his body. When he hits the water, the belt lifts his midsection, and the pack drives his head and shoulders down, and he rotates, and he goes face first into the sea. And the very device issued to save his life holds him in that position while he drowns. Men were found still floating, still buoyant, still held up by the equipment that had killed them. The death toll from Exercise Tiger is genuinely disputed in the record, and I will give you both figures rather than pick the more dramatic one. The commander of the naval force involved reported 749 dead. A later Allied headquarters statement gave 639, broken down as 442 soldiers and 197 sailors. Both come from official sources. Historians have argued over the difference for decades. What is not disputed is this. On D-Day itself, the Utah Beach landings, which Exercise Tiger was rehearsing, cost roughly 197 American lives. More Americans died in the rehearsal than in the assault it was rehearsing for. Now, here is where I have to be careful, and I want you to watch me be careful, because this is the exact point at which a documentary tells you a satisfying lie. The satisfying story is that Exercise Tiger caused the rescue flotilla, that the Allies looked at the drowned men of Lyme Bay and built the force that would save 1,400 lives 6 weeks later. It is a clean causal line. It is emotionally perfect. It is also false, and the timeline is what kills it. The 60 boats were already being selected and shipped to England before Exercise Tiger took place. The men who would crew them were already on their way. Whatever set that decision in motion, it was not Lyme Bay, because Lyme Bay had not happened yet. What Exercise Tiger did do is documented and real. Radio procedures between the American and British forces, which had failed catastrophically that night, were standardized. Lifebelt training was overhauled, and men were finally taught where the belt actually goes. Those changes saved lives on June 6. But it did not build the flotilla. The flotilla was already coming. I am telling you this because a story like this one is only worth anything if the parts that are true can be trusted completely, and the moment I start improving the causation to make the narrative land better, you have no way of knowing what else I have improved. So where did the boats come from? The Coast Guard's own historians tell a stranger and less tidy story. The idea, they say, came from the president. Franklin Roosevelt, some weeks before the invasion, raised the question of what would happen to men in the water and suggested the operation needed a dedicated rescue force. He passed it to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. King took it to the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Vice Admiral Russell Weyshe, and Weyshe said he had something that might do. There is a famous version of this exchange that you will find in books and articles and documentaries, in which Churchill laments that losses in the Channel will be terrible and that it is a pity the Allies have no dedicated rescue service, and Roosevelt replies, "But we do, the Coast Guard." It is a wonderful line. It is the single most quotable sentence in this entire story. And the Coast Guard's own historians, in their own official account, introduce it with the words, "So the story goes," and note that some even claim it happened. That is what a historian writes when he is telling you, as politely as he can, that he does not believe it. So I am not going to use it. It is legend. It may even contain something true about how the decision felt to the men who made it, but it is not evidence. Here is what not legend is. Whatever the chain of decision, it was made astonishingly late. Only weeks before the largest seaborne invasion in human history, somebody looked at a plan of unimaginable complexity, a plan years in preparation involving millions of men, and noticed that in all those thousands of pages, nobody had written down what to do about the ones who fall in. And then, in the time remaining, they built the thing that was missing. The boats chosen were 83-foot patrol craft, built by the Wheeler shipyard in Brooklyn, New York. 60 of them were pulled off anti-submarine patrol along the American East Coast, where they had spent the war hunting German submarines and, mostly, not finding them. They were made of wood. This mattered enormously, and in two opposite directions at once. The wooden hull made them a fire hazard. 2 gasoline engines, large fuel tanks, and a hull built of timber, one tracer round in the wrong place, and the boat becomes a bonfire. The crews called them matchboxes, and they were not being poetic. Every man aboard understood precisely what he was standing on. But wood is nearly invisible to a magnetic mine. The channel approaches to Normandy were seeded with German mines designed to sense the magnetic signature of a steel hull passing overhead. A wooden boat has almost no such signature. She can float over a magnetic mine, and the mine does not know she is there. And she draws only about 5 feet of water, so she can work close inshore where anything larger would ground. So the boats that were expendable turned out, by pure accident of their construction, to be exactly the right boats for the job. Nobody designed them for this. They were built to chase submarines. They ended up being the only craft in the entire invasion fleet that could get in close, over a minefield, to where the drowning men were. They were shipped to England as deck cargo, carried piggyback on freighters across the Atlantic, and assembled at Poole, on the Dorset coast. They were renumbered, Coast Guard 1 through Coast Guard 60, and they were given a name that tells you everything about how much thought had gone into them and how little time there had been. Rescue Flotilla 1, not 14, not 22, 1. There had never been another. 840 men, 60 wooden boats, and a mission without precedent. They were commanded by a Coast Guard reserve officer named Alexander Stewart. Pause on that. The man who commanded the first dedicated combat sea rescue force in the history of naval warfare was not a career officer from Annapolis. He was a reservist, in a service the regular Navy had spent a century and a half regarding as a distant and slightly embarrassing cousin. 30 boats went to the American sector, to Omaha and Utah. 30 went to the British and Canadian beaches, to Gold, Juno, and Sword. And then they waited for the weather. Now, before we go further, I want to establish something clearly, because a great deal of popular history about the Coast Guard at Normandy overstates its case, and I would rather this account be trusted than exciting. The Coast Guard did not sweep the mines. That was overwhelmingly the Royal Navy. More than 250 minesweepers worked through the night of June 5, clearing 10 channels across the Bay of the Seine and marking them with lighted buoys. By 3:30 in the morning, the lanes were open. The American naval commander of the Western Task Force, Rear Admiral Alan Kirk, wrote afterward that it could be said without fear of contradiction that minesweeping was the keystone in the arch of the operation, and that the performance of the minesweepers could only be described as magnificent. He was right. They were British. They deserved the credit. The Coast Guard did not mark the beaches either. 2 Royal Navy midget submarines, tiny craft called X-20 and X-23, had been sitting submerged off the Norman coast for days, surfacing before dawn on June 6 to show shoreward lights that guided the British and Canadian assault forces onto Juno and Sword. That operation was code-named Gambit, which is a name chosen by a man with a bleak sense of humor, because a gambit in chess is a piece you sacrifice. The two American beaches were not marked this way. The offer was made to the American commanders. They declined it. I am telling you all of this because the moment a documentary starts quietly annexing other people's achievements is the moment you should stop believing anything else it says. What the Coast Guard did at Normandy came out of its own institutional history, and that history is where this story actually begins. In the year 1878, the United States government formally organized a service called the Life-Saving Service. Its business was not war. Its business was shipwreck. Along the American coast in that era, ships came ashore constantly. There was no radar, no reliable forecasting, no radio. A sailing vessel caught on a lee shore in a gale went onto the sand and broke up in the surf, sometimes within sight of people standing on the beach, and the people on the beach watched the crew drown because there was nothing anyone could do. The life-saving service existed to change that. The men it created were called surfmen. A surfman's job was to go into breaking surf in an open boat, under oars, in weather that had just destroyed a much larger vessel, and bring men off a wreck. He trained for it endlessly. He learned to read a breaking wave. He learned to hold an open boat, stern on to a following sea, in conditions that would roll her over in an instant if he got it wrong. He learned to launch off a beach, through surf, running the other way, which is a thing that should not be possible, and which requires a crew to row into the face of a breaking wave, and mean it. The service kept its stations manned along hundreds of miles of coast. Its men went out in conditions where going out was very close to suicide. A substantial number did not come back. There is a phrase associated with that service, and like most famous phrases it has been polished by retelling, so let me be exact. The regulations of the life-saving service, revised at the end of the 19th century, stated that a keeper would not desist from his efforts until by actual trial the impossibility of effecting a rescue was demonstrated. That is the regulation. It is not a slogan. It is an administrative sentence, and it is one of the most demanding sentences ever written into a rulebook, because of what it forbids. It forbids you from deciding in advance that something cannot be done. You may only conclude that a rescue is impossible by going out and attempting it and failing. Out of that regulation, and out of the culture it built, came something the surfmen said among themselves. You have to go out. You do not have to come back. That phrase never appeared in any regulation. It is not official. It is what the men said to each other, which is a far more reliable indicator of what an organization actually believes than anything its administrators write down. In January 1915, the life-saving service was merged with the revenue cutter service, and the combined organization was given a new name, the United States Coast Guard. Now, I want to be precise about what kind of institution that was, because the words National Maritime Service suggest something far grander than the reality. On the day it was created, the entire United States Coast Guard consisted of roughly 255 officers and 3,900 enlisted men. It had 25 cruising cutters. It had 20 harbor cutters. That is the whole service. Fewer men than a single infantry brigade. The Navy's view of it was expressed in a nickname that the Coast Guard heard for decades and did not enjoy. They called it the Hooligan Navy. Not a fighting service, not a serious one. The outfit that pulls drowning swimmers out of the surf and checks the paperwork on cargo ships. And then, between 1920 and 1933, the United States attempted to prohibit alcohol, and enforcement of that prohibition at sea fell to the Coast Guard. What followed was a decade of small boat work of a very particular kind. Fast launches, running without lights, close inshore, at night, in shallow water, chasing other fast launches crewed by men who did not want to be caught and who knew the coast intimately. It was not glamorous. Large parts of the American public regarded the whole enterprise as an absurdity and regarded the Coast Guard as its enforcer. It was, for much of the service, actively demoralizing. But consider what it produced. It produced a generation of coxswains, the men who actually steer small boats, who had spent years handling powered craft at speed, in the dark, in surf, in shoal water, against a clock, with someone actively trying to evade them. There is no naval academy on Earth that could have designed a better school for landing a boat full of soldiers on a hostile beach in a swell. And when the Navy went looking, in the early 1940s, for men who could handle the flat-bottomed landing craft that amphibious warfare would demand, it found that the people who could already do this were disproportionately in the service it had been calling the hooligan Navy. I want to be careful here too. I have not found a document in which a naval officer writes down, in plain words, "We are assigning Coast Guardsmen to landing craft because of their surf experience." If that order exists, it has not surfaced. What is documented is the outcome. Coast Guardsmen ended up crewing landing craft and manning assault transports across every theatre of the war in numbers wildly out of proportion to the size of the service. At Normandy, they manned 99 warships and large landing vessels, plus dozens of smaller craft. Somebody clearly knew what they had, even if nobody wrote down why. And if you have seen one photograph of D-Day, you have almost certainly seen theirs. The image of a landing craft ramp dropping, of soldiers wading into chest-deep water toward a smoking shoreline, photographed from behind and slightly above, looking out through the open bow at the men going in. It is the most reproduced photograph of the invasion. It is usually called Into the Jaws of Death. It was taken by Robert Sargent, Chief Photographer's Mate, United States Coast Guard, from a Coast Guard manned landing craft that had come off the transport Samuel Chase at Omaha at around 20 minutes to 8 in the morning. The men going into the water are commonly identified as Company E of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, though I should note that the official Coast Guard caption records only that they were troops of the 1st Division. The photograph is routinely misattributed to other photographers. It is his. And here is what almost nobody notices about it. The man who took that picture was not going ashore. He was staying with the boat. Because when those soldiers were clear, his boat's job was to turn around, go back out through the fire, return to the transport, load 30 more men, and do it again, and again, all day. Now, before the rescue boats, before the photograph, before any of it, there was the problem of getting the assault force to the right piece of ocean in the dark. And this is where we meet the man whose morning gives this story its title. His name was Miles Hopkins Imlay. He was 41 years old, from Washington, District of Columbia, and he had been in the Coast Guard since 1923. He had spent his career on cutters in Alaskan waters, teaching physics and seamanship at the Coast Guard Academy, and coaching the Academy football team, which is not a line that appears in the biographies of many men who end up commanding an assault group on the most important morning of the 20th century. By 1944, he was a captain. He had already been through Sicily, where he earned the Legion of Merit, and Salerno, where he earned it a second time. At Normandy, he held 2 jobs at once. He commanded the Coast Guard manned landing craft Flotilla that would put infantry directly onto Omaha Beach. And he was deputy commander of the entire assault group, which meant that if the man above him went down or withdrew, the assault off that beach became his. His flagship was a landing craft, not a warship, a landing craft, with thin plating and no armor worth the name. At 2:30 in the morning on June 6, in complete darkness, Captain Imlay arrived at the rendezvous point where his assault column was supposed to be forming up. There was nothing there. He was early, so he waited. And what happened next is documented in the surviving records with a clarity that is almost painful to read, because it is the single most human moment in the entire naval story of that morning. His column sailed past him in the dark. The landing craft carrying the tanks, the craft he was responsible for, went by his position without either party seeing the other. Black night, no lights, radio silence. Several thousand tons of shipping moving past a man whose job was to find it, and neither knew the other was there. So he went looking. He moved to the secondary rendezvous point. Nothing. He turned down the swept channel toward France, on the theory that they must have got ahead of him. He was, in effect, chasing his own invasion through a minefield in the dark, in an unarmored boat, with no way to call out and ask where anybody was. He found them a little more than 6,000 yards off the Norman coast. At 4:30 in the morning, an officer aboard one of those tank landing craft looked up and recorded seeing Imlay's boat coming alongside the column, out of the darkness, to pass final instructions. Sunrise was still an hour and a half away. I want to be scrupulous about what Imlay did and did not do in the hours that followed, because there is a temptation in a story like this to make one man responsible for everything, and it is a temptation that produces bad history. Off Omaha that morning, 32 amphibious tanks were meant to swim ashore, floating on canvas screens. 27 of them sank. The sea was too rough, and they were launched too far out, and most of them went to the bottom, some with their crews inside. Imlay did not order that launch. The record is clear. The army had directed that the decision to launch would be made on the spot by the senior army officer of each tank battalion. One of those officers looked at the sea and launched. The other looked at the same sea and refused, and had his tanks carried directly onto the sand instead. His tanks lived. That was not Imlay's call, and I am not going to hand it to him for the sake of drama. What Imlay did do is written into his Silver Star citation, and the language of that citation is worth hearing exactly, because military award citations are written in a bloodless bureaucratic register, and every so often one of them accidentally tells the truth. Undaunted by heavy enemy fire, it reads, "Captain Imlay courageously took station close to the shore on the early morning of D-Day, and throughout the most bitter period of the fighting, coolly and promptly made spot decisions on the reorganization, grouping, and dispatching of craft to the beach." Spot decisions. On the reorganization, grouping and dispatching of craft to the beach. Strip out the bureaucracy, and here is what that means. Omaha Beach, on the morning of June 6, was chaos. Landing craft were arriving at the wrong beaches. Units were being put ashore, hundreds of yards from where they were meant to be. Boats were milling offshore because the men aboard them could see what was happening on the sand, and could not raise anyone who could tell them where to go. And in the middle of that, a 41-year-old former physics instructor was driving an unarmored landing craft up and down the shoreline, under direct fire, sorting it out, telling boats where to go, regrouping units that had scattered, sending men in. The Coast Guard's own account says he cajoled, threatened, and encouraged the ships and craft all up and down the waters off the Omaha assault area, all morning. Threatened. That is in the official history. And then, at around 8 o'clock that evening, the officer commanding the assault group withdrew his transport from the assault area, as he was supposed to do, which meant that command of the naval assault off Omaha Beach passed to Captain Miles Imlay. He was subsequently made port director of the artificial harbour the Allies towed across the channel and assembled off that beach. He retired in 1956 as a rear admiral. Now, let us go back to the water, because the men in it have been waiting. The invasion fleet crossed the channel on the night of June 5 into June 6, in weather that was, by any reasonable standard, unfit for the operation. A gale had already forced a 24-hour postponement. The forecast that persuaded General Eisenhower to go had identified a narrow gap in the weather, and the gap was not calm. It was merely survivable. Wind out of the west at around 18 knots, a sea that the records describe as slightly rough to rough, which in a flat-bottomed landing craft loaded to the gunwales with soldiers is not a gentle motion. The water temperature that morning was written down in the logs of British warships lying off the beaches. 52 degrees Fahrenheit on one cruiser, 54 on another, air temperature about the same. I said earlier what that does to a man. Let me be more exact, because the exactness is the whole point. At around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, immersion produces what is called cold shock, and it is involuntary. The moment the water closes over a man, he gasps, a deep, uncontrolled inhalation. If his face is under water at that instant, he inhales water. His breathing then goes rapid and shallow and he cannot slow it by choosing to. His heart rate spikes. If he survives that first minute, he then begins to lose his hands. Grip strength and manual dexterity fall away by more than half within minutes. He is fully conscious. He can see the boat. He can see the rope. He simply cannot hold it. This is the fact around which the entire day turns. A man in 52-degree water is not, in most cases, going to save himself. Somebody has to come and physically take him out. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, several thousand men entered that water. Landing craft swamped in the swell. Landing craft struck mined obstacles. Landing craft were hit by artillery from the bluffs and disintegrated with all their men aboard. 27 amphibious tanks went to the bottom off Omaha alone. Every one of those events put men into 52-degree water, weighed down by equipment, with functioning hands for about 10 minutes. And this time, for the first time in the war, somebody was coming for them. The cutter that would become the most decorated of the 60 was designated Coast Guard 16. Her crew nicknamed her the homing pigeon. She was on station before sunrise, and she began picking up survivors from disabled landing craft at 5:30 in the morning. Sunrise was at 2 minutes to 6. The first assault waves touched the beaches at 6:30. So the sequence of that morning, precisely, is this. The rescue boats began saving lives before the sun came up, and before the invasion they were rescuing men from had formally begun. By 9:30, Coast Guard 16 had 90 men aboard, pulled from the sea, and had transferred them to a transport. She went back. By the end of the day, she had taken 126 men out of the water, the highest total of any boat in the flotilla. One of her crew, a motor machinist's mate named Michael Swierks, went into the channel himself to bring in men who could no longer swim to the boat. He described that night afterward in words that have the flat quality real testimony always has, and invented dialogue never quite manages. The night of the invasion was unbelievable, he said. There was a continuous flash of light in the sky, and we could hear the bombs. It was non-stop fire. He was decorated for what he did that day. 16 members of that single boat's crew were decorated for that one day. Another cutter, Coast Guard 1, escorted the first waves of landing craft into the Omaha assault area, which is to say she went in with them, and stayed. Before 7 in the morning, she pulled 28 men from a sunken British landing craft, 24 soldiers and 4 Royal Navy sailors. And here the official history records a detail that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. Her crew went over the side, into the 52-degree water, to tie lines around the survivors, because the survivors were too cold to help themselves aboard. They had to tie ropes around men who could no longer close their hands. Later that morning, the same cutter recovered 19 more survivors, 14 of them Coast Guardsmen, off a landing ship that had been destroyed on the beach. She spent the entire day working within 2,000 yards of the shoreline, well inside the range of every German gun that could see her. She came through it without a single casualty. Off Utah, the cutters worked the wreckage of a control ship that had struck a mine and gone down. Off the British beaches, one cutter followed the first wave in at 20 minutes to 8, pulled 5 men out of a burning craft, and had to keep them below decks because the sea was too rough to transfer them anywhere. Another took 32 British soldiers and sailors out of the channel. Another came under fire from a German shore battery while pulling men from a swamped landing craft, and her crew watched a British battleship silence the battery for them, which is not a thing that happens often, and is not a thing anyone forgets. One of the flotilla's coxswains, a man named Jack Hamlin, described what he understood his job to be that day, and his description is the plainest statement of the entire principle I have found anywhere in the record. "Be nothing," he said, "but just be a lifeguard. We were not there to destroy anybody, to kill anybody. We were there just to do rescue operations, and that is what we did." He also said something else, later, that I am including because it is what the day actually cost the men who spent it saving people. "We did see some of them with half their face shot off," he said, "or missing an arm or a leg. It was quite a shock having to see that. I had never seen a dead person in my life. These were not hardened men. They were mechanics and fishermen and kids from coastal towns, and they spent June 6, 1944, pulling ruined human beings out of freezing water, hour after hour, and then going back out for more. And now the detail that I found in the official record, and that I am including, precisely because it is not heroic and not tidy. One of the cutters, Coast Guard 24, spent 2 days attached to a British warship, being used as a messenger boat. Confused staff officers, with no idea what this small American wooden craft was for, assigned her to run errands. Her own action report records what those errands included. The phrase in the report, in quotation marks, is fetching an officer's pipe. That is what a new capability looks like on its first day. Half the system does not know it exists. Somebody senior looks at a small boat with no obvious purpose, decides it is idle, and gives it a job. Nobody was being wicked. It was a gap in the design. The same gap, in miniature. By the end of June 6, the 60 boats of Rescue Flotilla 1 had taken more than 400 men out of the English Channel. The service's own records break it down: 194 off Omaha, 157 off Utah, 133 off the British and Canadian beaches. Not one cutter was lost to enemy fire that day. 2 of them, Coast Guard 27 and Coast Guard 47, would founder later that month, on June 21, in the great storm that tore into the Channel and wrecked one of the artificial harbours. No lives were lost. If you are getting something out of this, a like helps the video, and subscribing means the next one finds you. Both take a second, and both make a real difference to whether stories like this get made. Now I have to tell you about the Coast Guardsman who died, because a story about a rescue service that omits its own dead is a story that is flattering itself. The Coast Guard did not only crew the rescue cutters, it crewed landing craft, and on Omaha Beach that morning, that was among the most lethal jobs in the world. A particular type of vessel, the landing craft infantry, was designed to run its bow onto a beach and put roughly 200 soldiers ashore, down ramps on either side of the bow. To do this, it had to drive itself deliberately aground, in daylight, within a few hundred yards of prepared German positions, and then sit there, motionless, a large and completely stationary target, while 200 men filed slowly down 2 narrow ramps. An entire flotilla of these vessels at Omaha was Coast Guard manned. It was Captain Imlay's flotilla. 4 of them were destroyed that morning. 1 struck a mine attached to a beach obstacle and was hit repeatedly by shellfire while she was landing her troops. Her commanding officer was a young reserve lieutenant named Coit Hendley, and he wrote an action report afterward that does the job better than any narration could. The shells began hitting the ship, he wrote. They tore into the compartments and exploded on the exposed deck. Machine guns opened up. Men were hit, and men were mutilated. There was no such thing as a minor wound. His ship got her wounded off onto a transport before she capsized and sank. He was awarded the Silver Star. One of his seamen, a young man named Gene Oxley, volunteered twice to carry a line ashore through chest-deep water under machine gun and shell fire, so that the soldiers coming down the ramps would have something to hold on to in the water. Of the 36 men who tried to follow that line ashore, 6 made it. Oxley survived his ship's sinking. He survived a second sinking the same day. He was awarded the Silver Star. Another of the 4, Landing Craft Infantry 91, was hit again and again after grounding. A shell went into her forward troop compartment and killed everyone in it. 7 of her Coast Guard crew died, 11 were wounded. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Arend Vin, was awarded the Silver Star. Her sister ship beached in her lee, in the shelter of the burning wreck, and an explosion ripped through her forward compartments. 25 soldiers aboard her were killed. The fire was so intense that 24 of them could not be reached, and they remained in that compartment. They stayed there for 80 years. Between 2023 and 2025, the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency exhumed and worked through the commingled remains. 8 of those men were individually identified and returned to their families. In May of 2025, the remaining 16 were buried together at the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. 81 years. Some of the men who went to those funerals were the grandchildren of women who had died, still not knowing where their sons were. The 2 burning ships became, for the rest of that morning, landmarks. Incoming landing craft steered by them. So did German artillery observers. A 4th Coast Guard landing ship took 10 direct hits while stranded on a sandbar. Those 4 vessels represent the greatest loss of ships in a single day in the entire history of the United States Coast Guard. The number of Coast Guardsmen killed on D-Day is given differently by different official sources, and I will not pretend to a precision the record does not support. The service's own historians have published both 15 dead and 18 dead with 38 wounded. I cannot reconcile them, and, as far as I can determine, neither can anyone else. 15 men, perhaps 18, out of roughly 800 Coast Guardsmen in the assault. They died putting other men onto a beach. And now I want to draw this together, because there is a conclusion buried in it that is larger than the Coast Guard and larger than D-Day. Consider what actually happened here. The Allied invasion of Normandy was the most meticulously planned operation in the history of warfare. Roughly 5,000 vessels, years of preparation, logistics computed to a degree never before attempted, entire artificial harbors designed, built in sections, towed across the channel, and assembled off a hostile coast. A pipeline laid under the sea to carry fuel from England to France. Fake armies invented, with inflatable tanks and fabricated radio traffic, to convince the German High Command that the real blow would fall 200 miles away. The planners thought of everything, except the men who fall in the water. That is not a small omission. That is a category of human being, running into the thousands, for which the finest planning apparatus ever assembled had no box. And it was not because anybody was cruel. It was because the plan was organized around a question, and the question was, how we get the force ashore. Every part of the plan answered that question. Every craft, every schedule, every wave, every fire support ship, every one of those 5,000 vessels. And a man in the water does not help you get the force ashore. He is, in the pitiless logic of the plan, an event that has already happened. He is a subtraction that has already been taken. To see him at all, you have to be asking a different question. And the different question was being asked, and had been asked continuously for nearly 70 years, by an organization that the American military establishment did not take seriously enough to stop calling the hooligan Navy. Not because the Coast Guard was smarter, it was not. Not because it was braver, it was not. And the Royal Navy minesweeper crews who spent the night of June 5 clearing the lanes, and the crews of 2 midget submarines who spent days on the bottom off a hostile shore, waiting to surface and switch on a light, would have a great deal to say about that. The Coast Guard could see the men in the water for one reason. It had spent its entire institutional existence looking for them. A navy is built to project force. It looks outward, at an enemy. That is not a criticism, it is the entire purpose of a navy, and the projection of force is what won the war. The Coast Guard was built to look at the sea itself, and to ask what the sea was doing to the people in it. The surfmen of 1878, launching an open boat into a gale to reach a broken merchant ship, were asking that question. The men chasing rum runners through the shoals in the 1920s were, without meaning to, learning the skills to answer it. And when 60 wooden boats went out into the channel before dawn on June 6, 1944, they were the same question, asked in a war. This is not a story about a service outperforming its rivals. That framing would be false and cheap. Rescue Flotilla 1 did not defeat anything. It shot at almost nothing. Its entire purpose was to stand aside from the battle and do the one thing the battle had no room for. It is a story about what an institution notices. Every organization has a shape, and that shape determines what it is capable of seeing. The Allied planning staff at Normandy could see a great many things with extraordinary clarity, and it could not see the man in the water, because nothing in its structure pointed at him. He was not a threat, not an objective, not a phase line, not a supply requirement. He was outside the shape of the question. And so the thing that saved him was not a better plan. It was a different institution, with a different shape, that had been quietly maintaining an obsession with drowning people since before the invention of the aeroplane, and that happened to be available, on the right morning, to be asked. There is a memorial at Poole, on the Dorset coast, where the flotilla was based. It records the 840 men who crewed those boats, and it gives a number that is very slightly different from the one in the official histories. It says 1,437 men, and one woman. She was not pulled out of the water on D-Day. She was a British nurse, blown off a ship in the Channel in August of 1944, 2 months after the invasion, when the flotilla was still out there doing the same job it had been doing since before sunrise on June 6. One of the cutters found her and took her aboard, and the men who cut that inscription could have written 1438, and nobody would ever have known the difference. Instead, they counted her separately, so that whoever stood in front of that stone in 50 years, or 100, would know that among all those soldiers and sailors there had been one woman, and that she had been pulled out too. That is the whole ethic of the thing, carved into a wall. Not the 1438, the one. Rescue Flotilla 1 was decommissioned in December of 1944. The boats were dispersed, the men went home, and most of them, in the way of that generation, did not talk about it much. 2 of those 83-foot cutters still exist anywhere in the world. One of them is Coast Guard 83366. On June 6, 1944, she was designated Coast Guard 11, and she spent that day off Omaha Beach, pulling men out of the sea. She is the last surviving boat of Rescue Flotilla 1. She is sitting in a yard in Washington State right now, being restored to her 1944 configuration by a small foundation of volunteers who intend to make her a living museum. 82 years after that morning, the last matchbox is still afloat. The paratroopers and the infantry and the tank crews of D-Day have their films and their books and their memorials, and they have earned every one of them, and nothing in this account takes anything from them. But before any of them reached the sand, in the dark, 28 minutes before the sun came up over a coast that was about to become the most famous shoreline on Earth, a wooden boat was already working, not advancing, not attacking, simply moving through the black water, looking for someone. That is where this story ends, not with a beach taken, with a boat that went out, before the light, to bring somebody home. If this account was worth your time, a like and a subscribe help more than you would think. Thank you for watching.